Zethver stood in the observation deck of the starship Silent Watcher and looked out at the stars with his 4 eyes blinking in sequence, like he always did when he felt nervous about something important that was about to happen in his life. As a cultural observer for the Galactic Confederation, the young Tethrani had been waiting for this moment for 3 cycles since he finished his training at the Advanced Species Study Division, where they taught him how to watch other races and write reports about how primitive or advanced they were compared to the great civilizations that made up the Confederation of Peaceful Star Systems senior researcher. Veltara entered the room with her long blue tentacles swaying behind her as she carried the datapad that would contain all the information about his first solo mission, and Zethver felt his breathing slow down the way it always did when he tried to stay calm and professional, even though inside his mind was racing with excitement about finally getting to do real work instead of just studying old reports about species that other observers had already cataloged. Years ago, Veltara's voice made the soft humming sound that meant she was about to give him important instructions, and Zethver straightened his thin frame and focused all 4 of his eyes on her face, while his hands clasped behind his back in the formal position that showed respect to a superior researcher in their organization. The datapad showed images of a blue and green planet called Earth, where a species called humans had recently figured out how to travel faster than light, which meant they were now officially advanced enough to be considered for membership in the Confederation. But first, they needed to be studied and evaluated to make sure they would fit in with the peaceful ways of civilized galactic society. Veltara explained that the humans were currently engaged in what she called a primitive territorial dispute with another newly discovered species called the Zelanti over mining rights in something called the Kepler system, and this conflict would give Zethver the perfect opportunity to observe human warfare tactics and document their strategic thinking so the Confederation could decide what classification level to assign them. The Kethrani had studied dozens of similar cases during his training where developing species fought crude wars with simple weapons and basic strategies that never impressed the advanced civilizations, who had moved beyond such barbaric behavior thousands of years ago when they learned to solve disputes through negotiation and logical discussion. Instead of violence and destruction, Zethver felt confident that this assignment would be straightforward, because humans appeared to use kinetic weapons and chemical propulsion, which were the same primitive technologies that most developing species relied on, before they discovered energy manipulation and quantum field control that allowed for proper civilized warfare if such things were ever necessary, which they rarely were among advanced peoples. The mission parameters were simple and clear according to the datapad that Veltara handed him, along with the access codes for his personal observation vessel, which had been equipped with the latest cloaking technology that would allow him to watch the human fleet without being detected while he gathered information about their tactical capabilities and strategic thinking patterns. Veltara reminded him that his job was to remain objective and analytical like all good Kethrani observers, while he documented everything he saw so that his report would help the Confederation Council decide whether humans deserved to be invited into galactic society or whether they needed more time to evolve beyond their current primitive state of development. The humans had built a fleet of warships to fight the Zelanti, and intelligence reports suggested that their commander was someone called Admiral Jake Morrison, who operated from a large battleship with the strange name Terra's Sword, which seemed to indicate that humans still thought of warfare in terms of ancient blade weapons rather than modern energy systems. Zethver studied the tactical projections that showed human ship designs which looked bulky and inefficient compared to the sleek vessels used by advanced species, and their weapon systems appeared to rely on launching physical projectiles instead of using sophisticated energy beams that could be precisely controlled and targeted with mathematical accuracy. The Zelanti were also a developing species, but they had progressed further than humans in terms of energy, weapon technology, and defensive shielding, which meant that any conflict between them would likely demonstrate the superiority of energy manipulation over primitive kinetic systems and give Zethver clear examples of why humans needed more time before joining Advanced Galactic Civilization senior researcher. Veltara dismissed him with instructions to depart immediately and position his observation vessel near the human fleet before the conflict with the Xelanti began so he could document everything from the initial engagement, through whatever conclusion resulted from the technological disparity between the two. Developing Speciesother made his way to the docking bay, where his personal ship waited with its advanced sensors and recording equipment already calibrated for long-range observation and data collection while he reviewed the mission briefing one more time and prepared himself for what he expected would be a routine documentation of primitive alien warfare between two species that had not yet learned the civilized ways of peaceful problem-solving. The young observer felt pleased with his assignment because it would give him valuable experience watching developing species while contributing important data to the Confederation's vast library of cultural and military information about the many races that existed throughout the galaxy and someday hoped to join the advanced civilizations that had moved beyond the need for violent conflict resolution. Zethver positioned his cloaked observation vessel at what he calculated to be the optimal distance for monitoring the human fleet without risking detection while his advanced sensors began collecting data about their ship formations and communication patterns that would help him understand their primitive approach to space warfare. The human fleet consisted of approximately 40 vessels of various sizes arranged around the massive battleship Terra's Sword, where Admiral Jake Morrison supposedly commanded the entire operation, and Zethver immediately noticed that their formation looked random and disorganized compared to the precise geometric patterns that advanced species used for maximum tactical efficiency. Captain Lisa Hayes commanded a ship called Iron Phoenix that appeared to be leading a group of smaller vessels in what looked like patrol formations, while Commander Rick Stone operated from Dakota's Pride with another cluster of medium-sized warships that seemed to be moving without any clear strategic purpose that Zethver could identify using his training in military analysis. The human communications channels buzzed with constant chatter that confused the young Kathrani observer because instead of crisp tactical reports and logical status updates like he expected from a military operation, he heard references to something called Murphy's Law and mentions of ancient battles from their home planet that seemed to have no relevance to their current situation. In space, Colonel Amy Carter led what the humans called marine assault ships, which were apparently designed to carry soldiers for boarding enemy vessels, and Zethver noted this as evidence of their primitive thinking because advanced species had long ago developed automated systems that made hand-to-hand combat unnecessary and inefficient. The human ships themselves looked crude and bulky, with thick metal hulls instead of the elegant energy shields that civilized races used for protection, and their weapons appeared to be simple kinetic projectile launchers rather than sophisticated energy manipulation systems that could be precisely controlled for maximum effective. Venesheth recorded detailed observations about human ship design, noting that they seemed to prioritize durability over elegance and function over form, which suggested a species that expected to take damage in combat rather than avoiding it through superior technology and tactical positioning. The way humans talked to each other during their preparations also struck the Kathrani observer as unnecessarily emotional, with frequent expressions of concern for crew members and references to families back home which seemed like distractions that would interfere with logical decision-making during combat situations. Admiral Morrison's voice came through the communication channels as he addressed his fleet with what sounded like an inspirational speech about duty and sacrifice rather than a logical briefing about tactical objectives and strategic goals, which reinforced Zethver's assumption that humans were driven by emotion rather than rational analysis. The human fleet began moving into position for what their communications indicated would be an engagement with Xelanti forces within the next few hours, and Zethver prepared his recording equipment to document what he expected would be a clear demonstration of the limitations of primitive kinetic warfare against more advanced energy weapon systems. Captain Hayes reported that her ships were ready for something called Plan Crazy Horse, which seemed to be some kind of tactical formation named after an ancient Earth warrior, and Zethver made a note that humans apparently drew inspiration from their primitive past rather than developing new strategies based on logical analysis of current capabilities. Commander Stone's group began deploying what looked like sensor networks throughout the area, but their positioning seemed chaotic. Rather than following the mathematical patterns that advanced species used for optimal coverage and information gathering during pre-battle reconnaissance, the Marines under Colonel Carter's command were apparently loading into small assault pods that would be launched directly at enemy ships during combat, and Zethver found this approach particularly primitive because it relied on individual soldiers fighting inside enemy vessels rather than using automated systems to disable ships from a safe distance. As Zethver continued monitoring human preparations, he noticed that their fleet movements seemed to follow no recognizable pattern from his training in advanced tactical analysis, and their communication protocols appeared to rely on improvisation rather than established procedures that would ensure coordination during complex operations. The approaching Zelanti fleet showed up on long-range sensors, and Zethver could see that they had superior numbers and more advanced technology, including energy weapons and defensive shields that should give them a significant advantage over the primitive human vessels. With their kinetic projectile systems and metal hull protection, human communications became more intense as they detected the enemy approach, but instead of the logical discussion of tactical options that Zethver expected, he heard more references to historical battles and something called contingency planning that seemed to involve preparing for multiple possible outcomes rather than focusing on the most likely scenario. Admiral Morrison ordered his fleet to implement something called dispersal pattern delta, which caused the human ships to spread out in what looked like a completely random arrangement that violated every principle of fleet coordination that Zethver had learned during his training. Captain Hayes acknowledged the order and began leading her ships toward what appeared to be a suicidal position directly between the main human fleet and the approaching Zelanti forces, while Commander Stone's vessels started launching objects that looked like debris or asteroids rather than proper military ordnance. Colonel Carter reported that her Marines were ready for immediate deployment once the engagement began, and Zethver noted that the humans seemed remarkably calm about their apparent disadvantage in terms of both numbers and technology compared to the superior Zelanti fleet. The Kathrani observer settled back to watch what he assumed would be a quick demonstration of why developing species needed guidance from advanced civilizations before they could safely participate in galactic affairs. The Zelanti fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel in a perfect formation that demonstrated their superior understanding of tactical positioning, while their energy shields glowed with the distinctive blue light that indicated advanced defensive technology far beyond anything the primitive humans could possibly possess. Ether activated his recording systems to document what he expected would be a textbook example of technological superiority, determining the outcome of a military engagement. As the Zelanti ships began charging their plasma cannons, which had considerably longer range than the kinetic weapons that the human fleet relied upon, the first exchange of fire confirmed everything that Zethver had predicted about the engagement. As Zelanti energy beams reached across space to strike human vessels, while the humans could only respond with their primitive projectile weapons that seemed to bounce harmlessly off the advanced energy shields protecting enemy ships, Captain Hayes led her group of smaller ships directly into the heaviest concentration of Zelanti fire in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to close the distance and engage at shorter range, where their kinetic weapons might have some chance of penetrating enemy defenses. But Zethver calculated that her ships would be destroyed long before they could reach effective firing positions. Commander Stone's vessels began launching the objects that Zethver had assumed were debris, but now realized were actually asteroids and chunks of metal that the humans were using as improvised projectiles in place of proper military ordnance, which seemed like an act of desperation rather than any kind of coherent tactical strategy. The Zelanti responded to these primitive attacks with contemptuous ease as their energy weapons vaporized the incoming asteroids, and their shields deflected the few kinetic rounds that managed to reach their ships, while they continued advancing in their perfect formation toward what should have been an inevitable victory over the inferior human technology. Colonel Carter's Marine assault ships began launching small pods directly at the Zelanti fleet in what looked like a suicidal charge that would accomplish nothing, except the meaningless sacrifice of human soldiers who would be destroyed by advanced defensive systems before they could reach their target. SciFi prepared to document the decisive moment when Zelanti superiority would end this brief conflict. But something unexpected began happening that did not match any of his predictions about how the engagement should progress based on the technological disparity between the two forces. The human kinetic rounds that struck Zelanti shields did not simply bounce off as expected, but instead created small energy fluctuations that seemed to interfere with the shield harmonics in ways that SciFi's sensors could barely detect and certainly could not explain using his understanding of advanced defensive technology. Captain Hayes led her ships through a series of maneuvers that looked completely random but somehow managed to avoid most of the Zelanti energy fire while positioning her vessels in locations where their return fire struck the same shield sections that had been hit by previous rounds from other human ships. The asteroids and debris that Commander Stone's ships continued launching were not being fired randomly as SciFi had assumed, but were instead following calculated trajectories that caused them to ricochet off Zelanti hulls in directions that created unpredictable collision patterns inside the enemy formation. Some of Colonel Carter's marine pods actually managed to reach Zelanti ships by following flight paths that seemed impossible to track with energy weapons, and the small human assault craft began attaching themselves to enemy hulls in positions where the ship's own weapons could not target them. SciFi watched in growing confusion as the supposedly superior Zelanti fleet began experiencing system failures that his sensors indicated were caused by the accumulating effects of multiple kinetic impacts on specific shield grid intersections that created resonance cascades in their energy distribution networks. The human fleet suddenly shifted from what had appeared to be chaotic individual actions into a coordinated assault pattern that took advantage of every shield failure and system malfunction that their previous attacks had created in the Zelanti formation. While Admiral Morrison's voice coordinated the offensive with precise timing, Captain Hayes' ships moved into close range engagement positions where their kinetic weapons could fire directly through the holes in Zelanti shields that had been created by the accumulated damage from asteroid impacts and projectile strikes, while Commander Stone's vessels continued exploiting the weakened defensive perimeters. The marine pods that had successfully attached to enemy ships began cutting through hull sections with tools that looked primitive but were apparently designed specifically for penetrating the particular alloys that Zelanti used in their ship construction, while the human soldiers inside began fighting their way into enemy vessels. Sergeant Ben Murphy led one group of Marines who managed to take control of a Zelanti weapon system and turn it against other ships in their own fleet, while Lieutenant Kate Sullivan's team disabled the power distribution network on another enemy vessel, causing its shields to collapse completely. The tide of battle shifted with impossible speed as the Zelanti fleet found itself unable to cope with boarding actions by primitive soldiers who fought with simple weapons and individual determination rather than relying on automated systems that could be disabled by targeting specific technological vulnerabilities. Sensors recorded the destruction or capture of more than half the Zelanti fleet in less than 2 hours of combat that had begun with what appeared to be certain victory for the technologically superior force, but had somehow transformed into a complete rout of advanced ships by primitive human tactics. The remaining Zelanti vessels attempted to retreat but found their escape routes blocked by human ships that had anticipated their withdrawal patterns and positioned themselves to prevent any organized withdrawal from the battle zone while continuing to exploit every tactical advantage they had gained. Admiral Morrison's final transmission to the surrendering Zelanti commander included an offer of medical assistance for wounded enemy personnel and safe passage for those who chose to withdraw from the system, which struck SciFi as remarkably generous considering the humans had just achieved an impossible victory against superior technology. SciFi spent the next several days analyzing the recorded data from the battle, while trying to understand how everything he had witnessed could possibly have happened, according to any logical framework that made sense based on his training. in military analysis and his understanding of how technological superiority should determine the outcome of conflicts between different species. The young Kathrani observer found himself requesting permission to move his observation vessel closer to human operations so he could monitor their communications more carefully and perhaps discover some explanation for the impossible victory he had just documented in his official report to senior researcher Velterray. The human fleet had begun planning their next operation, which appeared to involve an assault on a Xelanti stronghold located on a planet called Xerion. Seven and Zethver realized that listening to their tactical discussions might help him understand the thinking processes that had led to their unexpected success in space combat. Admiral Morrison held regular briefings with his senior officers, including Captain Hayes, Commander Stone, and Colonel Carter, along with other commanders whose names Zethver began learning as he monitored their communications and tried to analyze the patterns in their strategic planning sessions. General Patricia Fox had arrived aboard a reinforcement vessel to take overall command of ground operations, while Major Don Rivers would coordinate air support and Captain Tony Webb would handle logistics for what the humans were calling Operation Desert Storm, which seemed to be another reference to some historical battle from their planet. The human discussions revealed a level of tactical sophistication that disturbed Zethver because their planning process involved considering multiple contingency scenarios and preparing backup plans for situations that had not yet occurred but might develop during the course of their operations. Their conversations frequently referenced battles and campaigns from their planet's history, including places with names like Thermopylae, Stalingrad, and Normandy, while they discussed tactics and strategies that seemed to draw lessons from thousands of years of warfare experience that no other developing species possessed. Captain Hayes explained to her subordinates how their victory over the Xelanti fleet had been achieved through what she called combined arms coordination, where different types of weapons and tactics were used together to create effects that were greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. Commander Stone described the asteroid bombardment as a technique borrowed from something called siege warfare, where attacking forces would use improvised projectiles to weaken defensive positions before launching direct assaults with specialized units trained for close quarters combat. Colonel Carter discussed the Marine boarding actions as examples of what humans called asymmetric warfare, where inferior forces could defeat superior enemies by exploiting weaknesses in their tactical assumptions and forcing them to fight in situations where their technological advantages became irrelevant. Zethver began to realize that what he had interpreted as chaotic and primitive tactics were actually the result of sophisticated analytical thinking that took into account not just immediate tactical considerations, but also the psychological and technological assumptions that their enemies would bring to any engagement. The humans seemed to understand that advanced species like the Xelanti would rely heavily on their technological superiority and would not expect primitive kinetic weapons to be used in ways that could exploit microscopic flaws in energy shield harmonics that even the shield designers probably did not know existed. Major Rivers explained during one briefing that human tactical doctrine was based on something called Murphy's Law, which stated that anything that could go wrong would go wrong at the worst possible moment, and therefore all plans needed to include preparations for dealing with unexpected problems and equipment failures. This approach to warfare was completely different from anything that Zethver had studied during his training, because advanced species typically relied on technological superiority to prevent problems rather than developing adaptive solutions for dealing with them when they occurred. Despite careful planning and preparation, Captain Webb described human logistics planning as being designed to operate under what he called contested conditions, where supply lines could be interrupted and equipment could be damaged or destroyed, requiring improvisation and creativity rather than reliance on predetermined solutions. The more Zethver listened to human military discussions, the more he realized that their entire approach to warfare was based on assumptions that no other species had ever needed to consider, because they had never faced enemies capable of challenging their technological advantages through creative application of primitive techniques. General Fox outlined the assault plan for Xerion 7, which involved simultaneous attacks from multiple directions using different types of forces that would force the defending Zelanti to divide their attention and respond to threats that their defensive systems had not been designed to handle effectively. The human commanders discussed contingency plans for dealing with various types of resistance, including automated defenses, energy barriers, and fortified positions, while also preparing backup strategies in case their primary assault routes were blocked or their initial tactics proved ineffective. Ether found himself deeply disturbed by the realization that human military thinking was not primitive, but was instead based on a fundamentally different understanding of warfare that assumed conflict would be difficult and unpredictable, rather than straightforward and technologically determined. The young observer began to understand that centuries of fighting each other on their home planet had taught humans to expect their enemies to be intelligent and adaptive rather than predictable and limited by technological constraints that could be easily overcome through superior equipment and logical tactical planning. The assault on Xerion 7 began with orbital bombardment from Captain Johnny Price's destroyer group that targeted the planet's energy barriers and automated defense systems, while Colonel Mary Chun prepared her ground forces for what Admiral Morrison described as the most difficult operation they had attempted since beginning their conflict with the Zelanti. Ether positioned his observation vessel to monitor the planetary assault from multiple angles, while his sensors recorded what he expected would be either a human victory that followed the same impossible pattern as their previous engagement, or a defeat that would demonstrate the limits of their unconventional tactics against properly fortified positions. The planet's surface bristled with defensive installations that could project energy shields across vast areas, while automated weapon systems provided overlapping fields of fire that should have made any direct assault suicide for attacking forces, regardless of their tactical creativity or adaptive thinking capabilities. Colonel Chun commanded 8,000 human soldiers against a Zelanti garrison of 50,000 warriors who were protected by fortress walls that could withstand energy weapons and kinetic bombardment. While their defensive systems had been specifically designed to prevent the kind of boarding actions that had proven so effective during the space battle, the initial human landing craft approached the planet through a storm of defensive fire that destroyed nearly half of them before they reached the surface, but the surviving troops immediately began implementing backup plans that seemed to have been prepared for exactly this type of devastating reception. Captain Helen Ross led a group of engineers who began converting the wreckage of destroyed landing craft into improvised weapons and defensive positions, while Major Sam Walker's reconnaissance units dispersed across the battlefield to gather intelligence about Zelanti defensive capabilities and tactical responses. Ether watched in horrified fascination as human soldiers, who should have been demoralized by their heavy losses, instead began adapting to conditions on the ground with a speed and creativity that seemed impossible for any military organization, regardless of their training or experience levels. The humans did not retreat when their initial assault failed, but instead immediately began implementing what Colonel Chun called Plan Baker, which involved using captured Zelanti equipment against the defenders, while simultaneously exploiting weaknesses in their defensive positions that had been identified during the failed first attack. Major Walker's reconnaissance teams had apparently been studying Zelanti technology and tactics during their previous engagement, because they quickly learned to operate enemy weapons and defensive systems with an effectiveness that suggested they had been preparing for this possibility long before the battle began. Captain Ross's engineers demonstrated the same terrifying adaptability as they began incorporating Zelanti energy systems into human equipment to create hybrid weapons that combine the advantages of both technologies while eliminating many of the vulnerabilities that had made purely human equipment less effective. The human assault forces divided into small groups that attacked the Zelanti fortress from dozens of different directions, while using tactics that seemed to change constantly as they learned more about enemy capabilities and developed new methods for overcoming defensive advantages. Sergeant Lisa Barnes led one unit that managed to penetrate the fortress walls by using a combination of human explosives and captured Zelanti energy weapons to create breaches in sections that had not been designed to withstand that particular type of combined assault lieutenant. Mike Torres coordinated artillery support using both human kinetic weapons and captured Zelanti energy cannons to provide covering fire for advancing troops, while simultaneously targeting specific defensive systems that had been identified as critical vulnerabilities by reconnaissance teams. The Zelanti defenders found themselves facing an enemy that refused to follow predictable patterns and seemed capable of learning and adapting faster than their own command structure could develop countermeasures, while human forces continued advancing despite taking casualties that should have broken any normal military organizations of recorded example of human soldiers accomplishing objectives that should have been impossible, including Captain Ross's team successfully converting a Zelanti shield generator into a weapon that could cut through fortress walls, and Major Walker's scouts learning to operate enemy communication systems to coordinate human attacks. The most disturbing aspect of the human assault was not their tactical creativity, but their willingness to accept what they called acceptable losses, which meant that individual soldiers would sacrifice themselves if their deaths might give other humans better opportunities to achieve mission objectives. Private Joe Clark volunteered to carry explosives into a Zelanti weapon emplacement, knowing that he would not survive the mission, while Corporal Nancy White held a defensive position against overwhelming enemy fire so that her unit could evacuate wounded personnel to safety. Colonel Jones' final assault on the main fortress involved coordinated attacks by all remaining human forces, using every piece of captured equipment and improvised weapon that her troops had created. During 6 days of continuous fighting while adapting to enemy tactics and exploiting every discovered weakness, the Zelanti garrison surrendered when human forces reached their command center after penetrating defenses that had been considered impregnable by every military analyst in the Galactic Confederation, including Zethver himself, who had studied the fortress specifications and concluded that no developing species could possibly overcome such advantage. Zethver realized that he had not been watching primitive warfare, but had instead witnessed something that no advanced species had ever encountered, because they had never faced enemies capable of adapting and evolving their tactics in real time, while maintaining the determination to continue fighting regardless of losses or obstacles. The young Kathrani observer found himself trembling as he understood that human military capabilities represented not just a different approach to warfare, but an entirely new form of conflict that could challenge every assumption that advanced galactic civilizations had made about their own security and superiority. Zethver returned to the Silent Watcher with data recordings that contained evidence of military capabilities that did not fit into any classification system used by the Galactic Confederation for evaluating developing species, and he found himself facing the impossible task of writing a report that would fundamentally challenge everything that advanced civilizations believed about warfare and technological superiority. Senior researcher Veltara expected a standard assessment that would recommend either accepting humans into the Confederation as junior members or suggesting they needed more time to develop proper civilized approaches to conflict resolution. But Zethver knew that neither option addressed what he had actually observed during his assignment. The young Kathrani sat in his quarters staring at blank report forms while trying to find words that could explain how a species with primitive technology had defeated enemies with superior equipment through tactics that seemed chaotic but were actually based on sophisticated understanding of adaptive strategy and psychological warfare. Admiral Morrison had granted Zethver a final interview before his departure, and the human commander had casually mentioned that their military academies studied conflicts involving dozens of different alien species that they had never actually encountered but had learned about through careful analysis of Confederation communication, intercepts, and intelligence gathering. General Linda Foster had explained that human military doctrine assumed they would eventually face enemies with superior technology and had therefore developed training programs specifically designed to teach soldiers how to fight against advanced weapons and defensive systems using improvised tactics and captured equipment defense. Coordinator Alex Martinez had revealed that human strategic planning included detailed contingency preparations for conflicts with every major species in the Galactic Confederation based on intelligence assessments that had been conducted since they first detected advanced civilizations in their region of space. These conversations forced Zephyr to confront the terrifying realization that humans had been preparing for galactic warfare since before they achieved faster than light travel, and their conflicts with species like the Zelanti were actually training exercises that allowed them to test tactics against advanced technology. The human military leaders spoke about Confederation defensive capabilities and strategic thinking with a familiarity that suggested they had been studying advanced species for much longer than anyone had realized while developing countermeasures for weapons and tactics that they had never directly encountered. Zephyr understood that his mission to observe human warfare had inadvertently provided them with detailed information about Kathrani sensor technology and observation methods that could be used to improve their own intelligence gathering capabilities and defensive planning. The report that he finally submitted to senior researcher Veltara contained a recommendation for immediate classification of humanity as what he called a Tier 1 martial species, which was a category that did not exist in Confederation databases because no previous observer had ever encountered anything like human military capabilities. His analysis concluded that humans represented a fundamental paradigm shift in galactic military thinking because they had developed warfare techniques based on the assumption that they would face superior enemies rather than relying on technological advantages to ensure victory through logical application of superior equipment. Velas' response to his preliminary report included demands for clarification and additional evidence because his conclusions contradicted everything that the Advanced Species Study Division understood about the relationship between technological development and military effectiveness among developing civilizations. Sheth found himself unable to provide the clarification that his superior requested because human warfare could not be explained using conventional analytical frameworks that assumed primitive species would fight primitive wars using primitive tactics that could be easily understood and categorized by advanced observers. The final version of his report included a warning that humans should not be considered for Confederation membership until their military capabilities could be properly evaluated by specialists who understood that their approach to warfare represented something entirely new in galactic civilization. His recommendation that the Confederation should avoid any direct conflict with humanity until they could develop countermeasures for adaptive tactics and psychological warfare was rejected by the Council as being based on insufficient evidence and overly dramatic conclusions about a primitive developing species. Their last official act as a cultural observer was to file a personal log entry that expressed his growing certainty that by studying human military operations, he had provided them with intelligence about Confederation capabilities that they would use to develop new tactics for conflicts that advanced species were not prepared to fight. The young Kathrani concluded his service with the Advanced Species Study Division knowing that he had failed in his original mission to assess whether humans could join peaceful galactic society because he had learned instead that their version of peace might be very different from what advanced civilizations expected. His final log entry contained a single sentence that summarized his experience and his fears about the future of galactic civilization. Now that humans had achieved faster than light travel and begun spreading throughout star systems that had never encountered enemies capable of challenging the technological superiority that advanced species had taken for granted for thousands of years. Tever wrote that he regretted everything about his assignment because he believed that by observing human warfare, he had witnessed the beginning of a new era in galactic history where the assumptions that had allowed peaceful coexistence among advanced civilizations would no longer be sufficient to maintain the stability and security that had defined interstellar society since the formation of the Confederation.